I am not speaking to those who already understand our cause for freedom. I'm speaking to those who have been lied to. If you grow up in the United States, you are naturally socialized to obscure settler colonialism in a settler colony. You are naturally socialized to believe that capitalism has existed before this with the dinosaurs and that the earth is gonna blow up.
The cavemen were trading rocks and they were getting capital.
This is what they were doing. Like you're just socialized to be a capitalist and to be a racist and to be a settler and then to be a Zionist, right?
Do you see that as an extension of those things?
100%. Oh, 100%.
Welcome to the Big Picture Podcast. My name is Mohamed Hassan, and it is my distinct pleasure today to sit down with Noura Erakat, legal professor at Rutgers University. And it's great to have you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's dive straight into it. You wrote a couple of weeks ago a piece in The Nation. It was called "Nothing Will Ever Be the Same." And in it, you begin by talking about what it means to be Palestinian in this moment. And the fact that you wake up every day with a calendar in your head, a counter of how many days it has been since October 7th. Tell me about what that feels like to wake up and that is the first thing you think about.
The essay that I wrote was marking a year of genocide, a year of bearing witness to a series of cruel catastrophes that only got worse, that our bodies had never seen before, and yet we metabolized them and then watched over and over and over again and never got used to it because there was always something worse. And from that moment onward, it was this paralysis of there is no life for me as life is ending for the rest of my being. Watching the slaughter in Gaza is watching an extension of yourself. And I think that I think a lot of people can say that even if you're not Palestinian, but certainly for Palestinians and certainly for Palestinians who are from Gaza, who have family and beloveds there. And it's this suspension and there is nothing to do. There's nowhere to go. There's no homework to finish or lectures to give or tests to grade or events to attend. If life is actually crumbling, right? It's literally an apocalypse. It's the end of the world. It's the end of everything that you know. And so in that suspension, it just became that every day was another day, counting the next day and the next day. Like we were reset in watching this. And it was paralleled by an absolute commitment to make it stop in any shape, way, or form. And so we were also counting our efficacy or our lack of efficacy in order to make it stop. And so that was the feeling, right? It's this incessant drive that we have the means and the power and the duty to end this colonial genocide of the worst kind. And at the same time, the least that we can do in our failure to stop it is to bear witness to just a systematic atrocity that gets at your very, I think the thing that's tearing you apart is whoever is doing this and enabling this and being apathetic to this is actually not human. And that's the scariest part, that what happened that allowed this to continue to fester, right? There's the horrors at what we're enduring, but there's the parallel horror of who are these people?
Yeah.
What are these systems that have literally relegated an entire people to massacre, to systematic massacre that they can get away with so easily? It was too easy. It wasn't that Israel had to pull up maps or had to demonstrate or even their propaganda machine had to go hard. They didn't have to do anything. All they had to do was say human shields a few times. No journalist was verifying that there were ever human shields. No journalist was ever tracking back to say, oh, wow, Israel has been using this same, talking point for years. And Human Rights Watch did a report in 2006 and said that there were no human shields in Lebanon. And then there was another one in 2008, and then another one in 2012, and another one in 2014, and another one in 2018 and 2021. Maybe we should interrogate this talking point. Nothing. All they had to say was Hamas, period. And that was an entire discourse. It was a stand-in for all of the worst nightmares and the anxieties that the West might have predicated on Islamophobic, constructions of violence and threat that never had to be unpacked. Hamas is comprised primarily of young men between the ages of 17 and 45 who were left without means and options in order to fight for their freedom. And this was one option that they had, which was to constitute themselves into a political party that was organized with a military wing that decided to use armed resistance on behalf of their liberation. A natural right, but also enshrined as a legal right. And yet, as a discourse, Hamas, now becomes a floating signifier without meaning. There's no rooting. It doesn't have a history. It doesn't have a starting point. It didn't exist. We don't know the history of that. It was established in 87, or it begins as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in fact, it was mostly concerned with Islamic revival as a way to return to something that they had, and has a military strategy and a political strategy gone. We couldn't talk about that. In fact, the first time that because it was really difficult to talk about it at first, right? Because as Halal Alian captured brilliantly, we were forced to audition for our humanity. Yeah. And so there was no room to even push back. Right? It was just like this constantly battling. If you were doing media work, it was a constant battle against chipping away at the narratives as best as you can in the 4 minutes that you had. When I finally started, and it didn't take long, it might have taken less than a week, to talk about directly what is Hamas, who is Hamas, interrogating journalists, why are you using the word barbaric to describe what happened on October 7th in a way that you have not ascribed to any other events that have ever happened, either by Israelis or anybody else, including the killing, the murder of my cousin at a checkpoint, shooting him 6 times above the waist in 2 seconds, and still holding his body hostage for years now. Would you call that barbaric? CBS News would not air that interview and then put me on a blacklist. NBC, when I tried to say who Hamas was, would not air that and put me on a blacklist and wouldn't have me back. So there is a way in which it became too easy for Israel to continue what honestly is industrial scale slaughter. Industrial scale. What has been described over and over to us by experts as the most number of children killed than any conflict in the last 4 years, the most journalists that have been killed in any conflict in the past 2 decades, the fastest rate at which starvation has been inflicted upon a population. These statistics over and over that tell us that this is an industrial scale annihilation. And still to be, not only that it was permitted, but then to be punished for naming it by honestly the most sanitary name that we can name this, which is genocide. That's the most sanitary way we can describe what's happened, which is to refer to an international legal convention that should have universal application and that can be measured by legal standards and still be punished for naming it by that name.
Yeah, and still have that name debated and picked apart and scrutinized. And is this technically a genocide, or what technically constitutes a genocide?
But I wish it would even be technically debated. It's not. It's, I'm reading, a lot of what the editors and what we're seeing come out from the BBC and come out from The Guardian and seeing from the New York Times. They're not even debating it. They're just figuring out how not to say it. They want to debate what plausible genocide is from the ICJ and what that plausibility means, right? But they're not debating the meaning. They're not debating the jurisprudence. they're actually complicit in making sure that we don't have that conversation.
So we're used to you talking to us and really educating us about international law and talking about the frameworks that define and codify international law, what the Geneva Convention is, what the definition of apartheid is. And this has been the argument that not only by yourself, but a lot of people speaking on behalf of Palestinians have used to try and raise this issue and raise the alarms for years about what needs to be taken seriously. And what I read in the piece that you wrote last month was a shift away from that, was a change in tone. Tell me what changed.
Well, I think two things are true at once. First, I want to just say that I am so proud to be a part of a legacy of Palestinian intellectuals and Palestinian fighters in all the ways that they, fight politically and otherwise, that have insisted, have been driven by a truth and by a commitment to justice that just feels like infallible. Like we will face anything because we are backed by such a deep truth and such a noble cause. And so my own work builds on decades of critique of Israel's system as a racist colonial system, one that was described as apartheid even before 1967. Why do I say that? Because after 1967, the application of two sets of rule for two sets of people becomes kind of blatant, military versus civil law. But even before the start of an occupation regime, the settlement of Palestine, and even the between 1917 and 1948, right, even preceding the establishment of Israel, were racist and colonial mechanisms that were being named, and that those before me drew upon international law, frameworks of racism. International Convention on Racism was actually the first international human rights treaty, right? And it was developed by the Third World to combat apartheid, particularly in South Africa and Southwest Africa. It is a very radical legacy of using law on behalf of emancipatory struggles, as opposed to using law in order to contain us. And I'm part of this legacy, which is using these frameworks. If you can't understand my Arabic and a demand for Palestine hurra ukarame, right? You might understand when I speak in a universal language and one which evidences a blatant double standard that's happening. Either it's advancing our cause or it's exposing, a crisis, right? So there was never, ever on my part, a belief in the law. If I had that belief, it's when I was a law student, which is precisely why I hated law school. I'm first generation. English is my second language. I went to law school thinking everybody wanted to, fight for justice. I had no idea that it was just another form of business school, right? It was a fast track to socioeconomic ascent in 3 years. I had no idea that I would be surrounded by that much privilege. That was me, that was my fault, it's my naivety, but I'm first generation. How would I have known, right? It was a miracle I didn't drop out. I think for most of my classmates who see me, they're probably shocked. that I'm,
They're like, is that Noura?
What?
What's going on? Why is she on CNN?
Why? I thought she was the one that was really unhappy and protesting and really hated, and my hair was falling out. Like I didn't want to go to graduation. It was so disappointing. I graduate law school and create my own job because my job that I wanted didn't exist. I got a fellowship for something like $30,000 with the law school debt to basically sue Israeli officials in US courts on a legal theory that I had, in a paper that I had written in school, and to plant BDS campaigns around the country. In 2005, this didn't exist. I was gonna create it because it just didn't exist. But even in its inception, I was doing organizing and lawyering because I never had this fidelity that the law was gonna save us. And I knew that from, but I tried. We sued the Israeli generals And then they were dismissed on non-justiciable grounds. And we went to the United Nations and we went to the different committees and we saw the ICJ decision. I had nothing to do with that, but we saw the ICJ decision, and there was this contradiction between what we thought the law was supposed to do and yet what it wasn't.
Yeah.
And that's what sends me back to school. To answer the question, what's that relationship between law and politics? And why I'm now in the academy as a legal scholar, very critical of the law, where I insist that we should have no fidelity to it, right? But we should use it strategically. Use it when it suits you, abandon it when it doesn't. Create new law when you can. We're not bound by it. Law is bound by what we want as people. Power creates law. And that's why so much of the law that advances the Palestinian cause for liberation is actually written in a moment of third world revolt, when the third world constituted an automatic majority, right? In the General Assembly, in this height of anti-colonial warfare. So that said, you're right, though, to still point out, notwithstanding my cynicism, right? I have been using it a lot. And I used it a lot precisely because I am not speaking to those who already understand our cause for freedom. I'm speaking to those who have been lied to. If you grow up in the United States, you are naturally socialized to obscure settler colonialism in a settler colony. You are naturally socialized to accept racist practices, even if you don't think you're a racist. You live in a country that functions on racial capitalism. You are naturally socialized to believe that capitalism has existed before this with the dinosaurs. Yeah. And that the earth is gonna blow up.
The cavemen were trading rocks, right, and they were getting capital.
This is what they were doing. Like you're just socialized to be a capitalist and to be a racist and to be a settler and then to be a Zionist, right? And so in my use of law.
You see that as an extension of those things?
100%. Oh, 100%. It's the same logics, right? It's the same logics of a racial supremacy, of a settler colonial ideology, of a form of militarism and violence, of an entitlement that no one earned, of a mythology of, logics of superiority. And so, but when I was using the law, I was speaking to audiences that might have understood this universalist language and using that as a framework to make an argument, but it was only one form of an argument to make.
I mean, we're speaking in the very early aftermath of a election, and the one that has really consumed so much oxygen this year. And I say that as somebody who is not American, who has still felt that you couldn't escape the gravity of what this conversation was about, and what it felt like it was about was that this is America, this great project, this beam of light and democracy and freedom in the world, fighting to defend itself from erosion or collapse. And here was this separate conversation of people on the streets, of people in these newsrooms trying to force people to have, which is that this whole thing is a lie. Like, this is not, this whole illusion about what not only the United States, but a lot of Western democracies are, is a lie if there is no space in this conversation for what is happening in Gaza. If there is no opportunity to talk about what this country, what this government, what these taxpayers are directly complicit in. How did it feel living through this year with this election, with these conversations, and with this essentially erasure of this issue that really in any other society should have been at the heart of what this election was about?
So you bring up a good point. I just want to wrap up the last question, which is to say the moment that I pivot away from that to speak in a very personal tone is the moment where I feel like all masks have been taken off. And at this point, let's just speak plainly about what it is, right? There was an expiration of the value of that kind of logic, because the truth is who am I talking to anymore? Because everything that I've been trying to tell you is now plain to see. It's so obvious. What is my role as an intermediary here? And so instead, I wanted to express who I am as a human and a Palestinian in the world, who is primarily trying to use everything that we have, every shred of energy, of work, of connection, of relationship, right, in order to stop this, right? And so there's something very similar that's happening when we get to the conversation about the election, which it just becomes exhausting because there's a mythology of American exceptionalism that is really powerful. And it's the idea that the United States, unlike other, nation state projects, is exceptional for having a different kind of history of pulling itself up by its own bootstraps, of building an economy, of being the youngest state that's now global superpower, of having the moral authority in order to police the rest of the world, and so that international law depends on what it does, of actually being, having a constitution that promises a kind of utopia as long as we can reach the potential of the promise of that constitution, right? And that American exceptionalist framework is one that shapes a lot of conversations. So that if you speak in that language, there's room for you because you're saying, I believe in this. I believe in this narrative that you say. But if you step outside of that frame and say, this entire story is a myth and it's wrong. And we live in a colonial and a settler colonial reality. And this is a white settler colony, right? Then you are not going to be able to speak at all. And we see that split obviously in our communities today, but we also see it in the struggle for Black freedom, right? Where Black freedom struggle has had many different strands. One of them happens to be a civil rights kind of approach of let's meet the promise of the United States. And another one is we can't be free at all unless the US doesn't continue to be an imperial power because we're connected. Our lives are connected to the lives of all racialized people elsewhere. What does that have to do with the election? Well, during the election, I think because of the way that the U.S. as empire is obscured, right? And the U.S. as colony, a settler colony, is obscured, there was a tendency to split what's happening in Palestine versus what's happening in the United States. There was an expectation that what genocide can continue in Palestine and the U.S. can continue on its own trajectory as if it was not related to this geography, right? There was this almost blinders that continued that the U.S. can continue to be as rich as it is, right? There's jobs here. That's why people come here. There's jobs here. Like you're going to get vaccinated here first and so on and so forth. How come? Why? And not making the connection of the U.S. as empire as extractive, right? It's that obfuscation that happens where we can continue to feed ourselves the myth that the U.S. can develop on its own without relationship to what it's doing abroad in order to enrich itself, right? And so that became with our allies, it became an incredibly difficult place. Like you just can't have that conversation with liberals, period, right? Period, because there isn't an analysis there. There isn't. But even with our progressive allies who do have an understanding of that relationship, but who couldn't see with us that whatever is happening in the United States is a reflection of what it's doing abroad. In order to understand, for example, U.S. police violence and its militarization, you can't understand that without understanding the U.S. in the Philippines, right? And the U.S. in Puerto Rico, and then the U.S. in Vietnam, right? And the U.S. in Korea. You're not going to understand white supremacy and violence here if you don't understand what's happening in Palestine. That there is being nurtured a supremacist movement of a racialized minority, like Jews as a racialized minority, who are seeking the mantle of having their own state where they govern it and are able to engineer population, where they get to be the majority by any means necessary and obfuscate a settler reality, right? And say that this is in the name of our sovereignty, right? And then critique us, that if we said anything about Zionism, then suddenly that was an attack on Jewish people. How do you expect to defend that position and not have white people in the United States not echo that same sentiment? Like Richard Spencer, who says that Israel is the future of European sovereignty.
Yeah, he astutely described it as a white ethno-national state, which is, I think was...
But that's what everybody's saying. Like, why do you want to have a Muslim ban? Why do you want to limit immigration? Why do you want to strengthen the borders? Why do you want to make America great again? You want to ensure white dominance. How do you think that happens? How do you think that wasn't going to happen when the entire liberal strata was normalizing that position and saying that it was in the name of human rights, and then mobilizing police, media, cultural institutions, universities, government, all to protect that position, and still expect that we were somehow gonna continue? It just, the expectation that you can separate the what we would call the metropole of an empire from its colonial periphery and what happens there is unfounded, short-sighted, and has brought us to this moment where we can't even properly diagnose what the problem is. And people want to point fingers at, but who did you vote for? And how could we have stopped it? The only way to properly stop this is to actually take responsibility, to account for our imperial privilege, and to stop it, and to end it. There was only one way that we're going to begin to account. And the only way to get to, for people to understand Palestine is also for us to understand that we have to be continuously in struggle against anti-Blackness and continuously in struggle against settler expansion on these lands, which is ongoing every single day. So that's a message to my own siblings, right? My Palestinian siblings, my Arab American siblings, that it's not just the shortcomings of others who can't see us, but our failure to be able to identify where we are and how we're participating in a project that's imperial and that's racist will also be insufficient. There's no nationalist road to Palestinian liberation. It has to be an anti-imperialist position that we take that leads us to our liberation. And it happens every day, and not only what we're doing and how we, protest how our taxes are used and what's done in our name and how the veto is used, but also what's happening in our daily lives around us.
That takes me to the final question that I want to ask you, and I would bring up, you mentioned South Africa before, and you mentioned the ICJ case and what that government was able to do in a way that no other Western government was willing to even consider, and in many cases fought and are still fighting. There has been this parallel narrative, this parallel fight that takes place outside of the frame, outside of the sphere of Western discourse. And you saw that happen with the UN General Assembly resolution that supported an ICJ hearing that was brought by Palestinians about apartheid, about the occupation. And when you look at who was on both sides of that spectrum, you had the United States, the UK, and Germany voting against it, and a lot of the smaller Pacific Island nations that are indebted to these countries. And then on the other side, you have the rest of the world, the whole world, that has a very clear understanding of what is happening and willing to speak about it, but might not necessarily have the power to. But that is an image that feels like we miss out a lot on, right? We're so embedded into what is happening in these Western countries that it feels like the world. It feels like the reality that we were fighting against. But what what does this other story look like? And especially when it comes to how do we affirm the sense of what is right and what is just in the world in a way that takes into account the rest of the world that isn't essentially complicit in what's happening in Gaza?
I think that's a really good question. And I'm going to nod to the folks who are in imperial centers that their world is where we are. Like, I think of I'm Palestinian, but I live in the heart of empire. Like, my duty is here to move the United States to stop being a source of harm, right? And also to, on behalf of others that I co-struggle with, what harm looks like to them, right? So there's a way in which that world question gets amplified, especially when this is a U.S. genocide as well. So that, I think that's why it just takes up such an outsized role in everything. But that said, you're right. The majority of the world is outside and is morally outraged and opposes what the U.S. has done. And we get evidence of that the U.S. and Israel are increasingly isolated. The U.S., when it wanted to even mobilize against the Houthis in Yemen, couldn't recruit Saudi Arabia into its coalition in order to do so. I mean, it's relatively weak in the sense of having this influence in the world because it's become so isolated and marginalized at the United Nations and elsewhere. And I think it does a lot for us to build more power in the global South or amongst the global majority, so to speak. I think that we're also not meeting our potential of what we can do in these places as well. Because even though there might be moral, right? In the United States, what's so difficult is that most people don't know enough, are, have a manufacturing of consent because of media and government and academic institutions. And so it feels suffocating to be in American society. But in other, global majority societies, it's not suffocating. But the problem is that their governments might be complicit, might still be complicit. And there's work to be done there as well. So why would several countries, including the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Iraq even, right, be exporting oil to Israel in this time, right? What other forms of complicity can we name, right? Why hasn't there been a severance of the Abraham Accords? Genocide is enough to sever those treaties. It's been enough, and not just to mobilize as Egypt did, to mobilize it as a threat that they would pull out of the Camp David Accords. There is work to be done in the global majority. I mean, I'm calling it global majority because that's what it is. And that's where, millions of people already understand what's happening and yet not meeting our potential of what we can do there. And that their responsibility also lies with the quote unquote official Palestinian leadership, which is also not turning its attention to these countries and these populations where they can mobilize as well. Too much attention, understandably so, has been focused on the United States as a source of harm, as a partner in genocide. This is a U.S. genocide, right? It's using its veto power. All of that is understandable, but it shouldn't be done to the neglect of these other opportunities that we have in order to mobilize our power.
And when you wake up tomorrow, now with this statement that things are different, nothing is the same again, what do you do? How do you mobilize? How do you act? What changes in the way that you take on this challenge?
So when I, in that essay, wrote that nothing will ever be the same again, I literally have disintegrated as the person that, whatever I was, the way that I mapped out my days, my priorities, the things that mattered to me, right? And I'm still being reconstituted because we're literally we're being shattered. And we're fighting through that pain. And we're fighting and we're struggling in order to hold on to a piece of life. And we're being made anew. I think it's still an open question. So when you say, what are you going to do tomorrow? Everything that I can. Everything that I can. Whatever is available to me. And, hopefully with enough grace to be kind to myself on the days that I absolutely can't, because the toll of this is tremendous. And I think that we haven't even had the space or time to be able to mourn exactly the loss, because in the midst of mourning, we're also enraged that more money is being sent and we're being blamed for our own cruel killings, right? And so mourning is stolen from us because we're enraged, and then we're catapulted into action. And we come back. It's this constant cycle. And I think that it's yet to be seen who we are after this, because it's ongoing, and it's about reconstituting ourselves and knowing that we are not the first to experience apocalypse, the shattering of our entire world. The majority of the world, as we were saying earlier, has experienced apocalypse. Most of Western civilization has been constructed upon the apocalypse of others, the extraction of their wealth and the decimation of their peoples, right? And so how is it that we reconstitute a world without fearlessness that imagines new possibilities that we can't see yet, without settling for the slivers, the crumbs that were offered?
Noura Erakat, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a huge thank you to our guest today, Noura Erakat. As always, we want to hear what you have to say about this conversation, so please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And you can find this and all of our other episodes in audio format wherever you get your podcasts from. And until next time, salam.